Okay, let's look at part 5. Open up the root space for part 5 and we see the name is part 5 SubRequest resolution failure. So what I have here is another accessor declaration, and it's got a grammar of indirect active 1. So that's the resource identifier that it resolves. And we see that unlike the other example accessors we've had so far, this instantiates a physical endpoint SubRequest accessor. So let's go and look at that implementation class. And what we see is the SubRequest accessor implements the source verb, and it doesn't actually return a representation of its own. It's a relay, and it constructs a new request and it requests active column 1, which is the resource we've been using all along. So it's going to be able to issue a request from this point into its address space and then resolve active 1 from that point onwards. So here we issue the request response, which causes it to be resolved and executed, and we return the response as the response of this endpoint. So we're basically, as the name said in the grammar, we're indirectly calling active 1 through an indirect request, a SubRequest accessor. So if we look at the address space in the Space Explorer, then we will see, as in all previous examples, that this space is just very much like part 1. It just contains a single endpoint. So you can kind of guess what's going to happen if we make a request this endpoint. It's not going to find the active 1 resource set because this space doesn't have access to it. But let's try that in the request trace tool. I've got the space set up. Here I want to do an indirect, I want to call indirect, well let's first of all call active 1 directly and see if it resolves in this space. And we'll find, of course, it doesn't. So now, if I resolve indirect active 1, it of course resolves to that SubRequest accessor, but so far we still haven't executed that. And if I now try and execute it, then what I get is a request resolution failure. So here we see that it tried to source active column 1, and if we look down in the stack trace, we see that indirect accessor called the SubRequest accessor, which issued a SubRequest for active 1, and then we find that the stack trace is giving us the same resolution display as we've seen everywhere else. So here I can see that the SubRequest was issued into the SubRequest space. We tried to resolve on the SubRequest accessor itself, but of course that doesn't match the grammar, and then that was the only endpoint in the space, so it failed. So we can fix this by implementing active 1 in this address space. So what we now see is this space contains an instance of active 1, and we hope that that means that our resolution should succeed. So if we try active 1 in this space, then it now resolves. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to turn on the visualizer so that we can look at the request being injected. So first off, I'm just going to switch to indirect active 1 because that's the thing we're actually looking at the moment. So I want to make a request to SubRequest accessor, and now I want to see how it actually issues its SubRequest. So let's request that. We see now that it actually does resolve active 1, and we get a request to that active 1 endpoint. So I go and look at the visualizer. What I see here is that that indirect active 1 request was made, and we see that the SubRequest accessor was resolved. So the request came into the address space, into part 5 subrequest space and was resolved to the subrequest accessor. So let's have a look at that. Here we see it was a source verb. The identifier was indirect active 1. And here we find again a record of how it was resolved. And if we look in the trace, we see that the request was issued into SubRequest directly, and the first endpoint that we found in that address space was SubRequest accessor. So the resolution occurred, and then the execution started. So the SubRequest started doing whatever it does inside its onSource method, and we see that inside this this endpoint, the SubRequest accessor, it actually issued a subrequest, and the subrequest it issued was for active 1. So if we click on that subrequest, then we find that the requester was the subrequest accessor, the identifier was active 1, and again we find how it was resolved. We see that the request was issued into the subrequest address space, it didn't match on the subrequest accessor, and it did match on accessor 1. So we resolved to accessor 1, we found this, and ultimately it returned us a string representation which we can view, which was active 1. So the visualizer is providing a much richer and more detailed cross-section through the address space. And so what it is like a general version of the request probe tool. It allows us to look at the resolution and execution and all subrequests of all the endpoints that have been resolved to during the execution cycle.